Today we have with us Professor Thomas-Pogge, who is a Leitner Professor of Philosophy and International Affairs and founding director of the Global Justice Program at Yale. He's a member of Norwegian Academy of Science, as well as a co-founder of Academics Stand Against Poverty, an international network aiming to enhance the impact of scholars, teachers, and students on global poverty. He's also co-founder of Incentives of Global Health, a team effort towards developing a complement to the pharmaceutical patent regime that would improve access to advanced medicine for the poor worldwide. Professor Pogge has extensively written on political philosophy, especially on John Rawls, Immanuel Kant, cosmopolitanism, and global justice. Welcome, Professor Pogge. Today we have, to chair this session, we have Professor Ashok Acharya with us. He's a professor of political science at the University of Delhi, and he has a PhD in political science from the University of Toronto. Before joining the Delhi University, he taught at the University of Toronto, Northeastern Hill University, and Utkal University. He was also a Henry Hart Rice visiting professor in global justice, South Asian studies, political science, and philosophy at Macmillan Center, Yale University. So welcome, Professor Pogge and Professor Acharya. Over to you. We can start the session now.
So I've spent my summer in China and Korea and in massive, interesting political conversations about the state of the world and what to do about it. And so this lecture will be colored by that experience a little bit. So let's start thinking a little bit about the moral condition of the human world, the way the world is now. You will say that in many ways the world has improved a great deal in the last 200, 300 years since the Industrial Revolution. That is certainly the predominant view in the West, where people say that we are so much better off than we were 200, 300 years ago. And of course, in many ways, that is true for the people in that part of the world. But on the whole, I think we have not made the kind of progress that the Enlightenment thinkers 200 years ago would have expected and hoped for. And in particular, we are defective in the following respects. First, like savages, we are still settling international disagreements in a barbaric way. This is Kant's phrase, by force and the threat of force, rather than through argument as if by a lawsuit. So violence is still an omnipresent possibility at the very least, and of course it is a very frequent occurrence in many parts of the world. Violence now, and war in particular, poses an existential threat to humanity and many other life forms on this planet. So there is a non-negligible risk that the next war, the next major war, will actually wipe out very large parts of humanity and our animal and plant species. We have not aligned human activities with the need to preserve a hospitable planet. You in India are very well aware of that in terms of both climate change and also air pollution. You are losing probably more than 2 million people a year just to air pollution in terms of premature deaths. And so that is a major problem that was illustrated dramatically this summer and is likely to get substantially worse. Then there's the problem of poverty. We have not eradicated severe poverty. We have 42% of humanity unable to afford a healthy diet, which the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, valued at $3.66 in 2021. So $3.66 at purchasing power parities, that corresponds to 88 rupees per person per day. That is what you need to spend on food, according to the FAO, in order to have a healthy diet. You can see the stats at the top there. For the world, 42%. For South Asia, it's actually 72.2%, a very, very large percentage of the population unable to afford a healthy diet. Now, again, people in the West are quick to point out that people have always been poor, that poverty was probably much worse in the past, and the World Bank is famous for constantly reiterating that, as is the Economist magazine. But I think we should not measure the quality of the present world by asking whether it is better or worse than past worlds have been. We should measure it against the existing possibilities. How good could we make the world with our existing capabilities? And there we have to say that the shortfall from what would now be possible is really quite appalling. Below, you can see the world income distribution on a logarithmic scale. And the average income in the world today is $58 per person per day. And you need about $5 per person per day, according again to the UN organizations, to be able to afford that $3.66 for healthy diet, because you also need to meet your housing, clothing, and so forth, other needs. So here you can see that even though the average income is $58, 42% of the world's population live below that $5 a day threshold, and that's really a dramatic failure. It wouldn't cost the people above the threshold very much to ensure that everybody is at least at the level of $5 a day, where so many people fall short. And of course, I was referring several times to thinking in the West, and we have to remember here that our views, both about the facts about the world, the explanations of what goes on in the world, and our moral assessments of the world, are deeply influenced by our particular position in the world, as you can see here in this humorous diagram from the New Yorker magazine. So people are among the more privileged are much more likely to perceive the world as just and to perceive any remaining suffering as inevitable than are people in the middle or near the bottom. To proceed, we also have not achieved global governance institutions that fairly take account of the needs of all. So very large populations are basically excluded from political decision-making supranationally and even within their own societies. So we have to conclude that relative to our vastly enhanced technological, economic, and administrative capabilities, we as a world, as a species, humanity, are doing quite poorly. We could do vastly better if we spend more of our resources on trying to achieve the minimal moral requirements that we more or less agree upon. And there is a real danger that without substantial moral progress in this century, past gains in quality of human life will be reversed either through a major war or through pandemics or through AI going rogue, or to any of a number of other potential catastrophe scenarios that are made much more likely by the way the world is currently organized. Now, why are we doing so poorly? What are the explanatory factors accounting for this fact? One thing that we often hear is that cultural diversity is holding us up. The West is committed to some very nice values, human rights, democracy, and so on, but other cultures, unfortunately, are hostile to these values, and so we cannot implement them on a world stage. So there is deep disagreement about values according to this explanation, and the shared official commitment to human rights is only skin deep. It is not possible to use this official agreement on human rights to resolve any real disagreements. And the reason for that is seen in the fact that some human rights are not accepted in some cultures. So, for example, freedom of religion, expression, political participation are standard values in the West, but are not widely accepted in the global South. And furthermore, some cultures observe additional values and duties that they prioritize over human rights in case of conflict, and that again detracts from human rights as a possible shared standard by which to organize our common lives internationally. Now, I don't agree with this explanation. I don't think that this is the explanation, the correct explanation of why we are in the condition that we are in. And I give you two reasons for that. One is that intercultural discourse on a widely shareable, morally based world order has never even been seriously attempted at the political level. The closest to it that we've had is the founding of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the formulation of it under Eleanor Roosevelt, which is some 75 years ago today, where there was a lively intercultural discourse on values. And moreover, agreement on a shared constitutional order has proved to be possible in some multicultural states and associations of states. So the idea that this is just in principle impossible and that cultural diversity is such that it doesn't lend itself to a reasonably peaceful resolution of conflicts is, I think, disproven by the facts at lower levels of human organization. If you can do it in a country like India or the United States or the European Union, then I see no reason why you could not also do it globally. Now, how is it possible where it has been more or less achieved? And how might it be possible supranationally? Here are 5 ideas in that direction. First, intercultural moral commitment to the peaceful resolution of conflicts, which requires rule-based political order. So the first thing is, can we agree across cultures that we want to have the peaceful resolution of conflicts, that we want to have a rule-based political order with systematic procedures according to which conflicts are resolved, rather than leave conflicts to be resolved by threat advantage, the exercise of either military or economic coercion. Now, this has to come with the recognition that this political order can be shaped in only one way. That is to say, cultures have to recognize that while we can agree to disagree about how particular countries should be shaped, and we can say, okay, some cultures want to organize their country in one way, others in another, we cannot, in a similar way, agree to disagree about the organization of the whole world. So we have to all recognize that the world can be organized, the human world can be organized in only one way, and that not everybody can get their way, that we have to compromise somehow and find a way of organizing the world together that is more or less acceptable to all different cultures. Thirdly, there has to be intercultural moral agreement that such a political order should leave space for a diversity of subsidiary associations and ways of life. This is something we find in multicultural states, where there is a considerable amount of tolerance for different religions, different kinds of associations, different regional or provincial associations, and so forth. And again, that is something that we would require on the global level for sure as well, where we would need to have significant space for countries and associations of countries to shape themselves in diverse ways. Fourth, there has to be intercultural moral agreement that any political order should enable human beings to lead worthwhile lives, free from violence and deprivation. And there is, I think, substantial value overlap on that. This is not always under the label of human rights, but it is under different labels: human rights, capabilities, various freedoms, basic needs being met, and so on. So in different national dialogues, these values appear in different ways, but there is wide cross-cultural agreement, I think, that the key responsibility of institutional arrangements at all levels, domestic and also international, is to enable worthwhile lives for human beings. Finally, there has to be intercultural moral agreement that any remaining issues can be resolved through fair procedures. So if we can't agree or don't agree on the basis of our respective values, then we will have to find procedures, for example, courts or voting procedures, that can resolve remaining disagreements. That is still much better than having these disagreements resolved through violence and the threat of violence or through economic coercion. So in sum then, the persistence of widespread severe poverty, the persistence of great ecological harms, massive investments in weapons of mass destruction, and the political exclusion of marginal populations, for example, most of Africa, all that cannot be explained by some cultures valuing these phenomena, by there being lack of agreement that these things are wrong and ought to be rectified. But I think there are feasible changes of our global order that would be major improvements by the light of every culture. And so cultural diversity does not really stand in the way of significant moral progress in the ways that I have sketched. Now, my diagnosis then is that the cultural diversity explanation of the sorry state of the world is promoted mainly as a smokescreen to obscure the fact that resistance to a value-based world order comes mainly from super-privileged elites who seek to preserve and even expand their inordinate advantages. So again, the Western states, and in particular the elites of the Western states, are pushing this explanation because it's really they who are reluctant, and they are reluctant to move to a more value-based order, not because they don't share the values that that order would be based upon, but because in such a new order, in such a more value-based, more moral order of the world, they would not be able to maintain their inordinate privileges. So the existing extreme inequalities in income, wealth, and power far exceed what could be justified by the values of any culture, and therefore would not survive in any kind of value-based global order. So here then is a little more on the alternative explanation that I want to provide for why the world is in the state that it's in. So long as we don't have a morally based order, states feel entitled and even obliged to serve their culture and their values, not by living up to them, by observing them, by honoring them, but rather by pursuing power in order to ensure the survival and eventual dominance of these values. In other words, states perceive themselves as living in a jungle. They see international relations as a kind of Hobbesian context in which they cannot afford to honor even their own values and are obliged to act in a power-maximizing way. Now, in this jungle of international rivalry, values must not be allowed to impede the pursuit of power, and can therefore at most play an instrumental role as tools or weapons in the context. In the context, this is basically the soft power dimension, where states are using appeals to human rights as weapons to beat each other over the head in order to gain political advantage, but do not seriously see these values as constraining their own conduct and that of their allies. This works as a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. People in the military ministries or defense departments, as they are euphemistically called, and in the foreign ministries are perceiving themselves to be living in a kind of jungle world of international relations. And because that is their perception, they behave the way in which one would behave in the jungle, and thereby they create the very jungle that they adduce in justification of their conduct. So states use their power toward protecting and increasing their power, and they use it in particular in the direction of influencing global institutional arrangements. So each state is trying to use what power it has to increase and protect its power. And one important dimension in which one does that is by influencing the rules of the game that in turn influence, for example, how the cooperative surplus, the social product of the world, is distributed among countries. So the more powerful countries try to push for more favorable terms of trade and terms of interaction internationally in order thereby to further increase their power. So if this is how states act, then our state must act in that same way to ensure its long-term survival and the long-term survival of our values. That is the self-fulfilling prophecy part. And then we get to a state where national security trumps all and also pervades all. It trumps all because we really cannot afford to sacrifice any potential power for the sake of satisfying moral values or for any other purpose, because we are in an all-out struggle in which other nations are competing with us, are our rivals, and are obsessed with power just as we are. And it pervades all because almost anything that you can think of is relevant to our power position in the world. So even domestically, governments feel that it is their sacred duty in the competition with other states to ensure that their population fully stands behind them, because if their population doesn't, if the government becomes unpopular at home, that will weaken it in the international competition and will thereby be detrimental to the state whose government it is. So that then leads to the result that governments feel morally obligated towards their people to generate support for themselves, including through undemocratic means, through manipulation of public opinion, through lying and deception, happens very frequently, and is justified in the minds of politicians by saying we must do that in order to be strong and strongly supported at home, so that we are better able to prevail in the competition with other states. So in short, states must disregard their values over a broad spectrum of issues in their foreign policy, but even in their domestic politics, in order to save these values, that is, in order to have enough power to protect these values long-term in a fierce competition among states. So we have then rivalry under contested rules, that is to say, a rivalry that is rule-governed, but governed by rules that are changeable and can at any time be renegotiated with a change in the distribution of power. As power shifts, the strengthening parties will try to renegotiate the rules in their own favor in order to thereby increase their power even further. And conversely, with power shifts, some parties will lose power, will have to concede less favorable rules, and will potentially get into a descending spiral of decreasing power and importance. Now, this sort of order is unstable and accounts for much of the instability that I started out with, in that states with a comparative advantage in military strength, states that are stronger militarily than they are in other respects, have a vested interest in a geopolitical climate of hostility. The more hostile, the more competitive, the more rivalrous the international climate is, the more power, political power, will be held by those countries that are particularly strong militarily, whose special strength lies in their military capabilities. And those states in the current world are, for example, or include the US, Russia, Israel, and North Korea. These are states that are systematically interested in rivalry, competition, tension, conflict, hostility, because the more of it there is, the more their military power counts. Now, this is not in any way criticism of those four states in particular. It's just to say that in any world that lives under this kind of contested rules system, there will always be states whose comparative advantage lies in military strength, and therefore states whose systematic interest is in keeping the world not at war, but at the very least on the brink of war. Unfortunately, a climate of hostility and tension and conflict is much easier to sustain than it is to avoid, much easier to create and maintain than to end or avoid. And so countries that have that vested interest are always at a certain advantage over countries that have the opposite interest. And because it is much cheaper to create tension than to avoid it, many states are actually deterred. Those states that have a vested interest in a more peaceful world are often deterred from investing in such peace efforts because these investments are likely to be futile. One example is Germany. In recent years, Germany has invested a lot in trying to make the world more peaceful by maintaining good relations with the Russians. And that whole investment in the end came to naught, in that tensions were revved up by the US and Russia, making essentially all these investments pointless and lost cause. Now, this is one reason why the current world is highly unsafe, because with wide access to weapons of mass destruction and AI, plus our ecological emergency and the pandemic threats we are facing, a pretty brutal rivalry, even if it is under changeable rules, is highly dangerous, because at some point something might go wrong. The world might actually go to war, be it over Taiwan or be it over some incident on the Indian-Pakistani border or whatever, or Chinese-Indian border for that matter. And if it does go to war, of course, the consequences could be extremely detrimental given the weapons that now exist and the technologies that now exist. There's also a second source of instability, which is arising from these descending spirals that I was talking about. If a country foresees that it is weakening and that it will be forced in the future to accept worsening terms of cooperation, it may prefer to fight now rather than to wait until it is more and more marginalized. I think this is a good part of the explanation of the recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia, that Russia saw itself in that state of being in a descending spiral and thought that I have only two choices. Either I get increasingly marginalized, weakened and weakened under the existing scheme, or I go to war now and take my chances so long as I still have considerable power at my disposal. Now, China is an important and interesting to think about country in this context. China has two different strategic options in the current world order. One is it can invest mainly in military strength and try to match or rival the military strength of the United States, or at least build up enough military forces to protect its corner of the world from encroachment by the US and its allies. The other strategy is to invest in economic and soft power instead of military power, and at the same time also invest in marginalizing the importance of military strength by promoting a climate of peace, by promoting moral progress in natural alliance with other countries whose comparative advantage also lies in economic and soft power rather than in military power. So countries like Germany, Spain, maybe the whole of the European Union, Japan, Indonesia, Mexico, Switzerland, these are all countries that would benefit power-wise from a more peaceful global environment. The Chinese have opted in recent years, very clearly opted for the first of these two strategies, which is exactly the choice that the US, of course, wanted China to make, that from a power point of view is favorable to the US, but is also the choice that the old USSR made in its day, pre-Gorbachev, and that led to the collapse ultimately of the USSR. So that's something to think about. But of course, the second strategy is not very obviously better because it has its own pitfalls, in particular, the problem that, as I said before, peace and a morally sort of steps towards a morally based order are much easier to derail than to promote. Now, if we wanted to make moral progress, what would it look like? What are the main things that we should be pushing for in order to achieve the kind of moral progress that I think is possible? We should, I think, focus on the global order. We should focus on institutional arrangements at a global scale. We live in a world in which there's a vast abundance of rules and procedures and institutional arrangements at the supranational level. That's one big thing that has happened since the collapse of the Soviet Union, that a tremendous amount of new rules and institutions have emerged, maybe paradigmatically the WTO, but many other things as well. And we should try to focus on this complex of rules and institutional arrangements with the idea of trying to move them, reform them in a moral direction under the idea that is expressed very well in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where it says everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. Now, in making such progress, we should focus both on substantive and procedural reforms that can be universally recognized as morally needed to improve the condition of the weakest in particular. So focusing on the weakest has the advantage that it is morally very clear-cut and also does not bring in a substantial way the rivalry with among the major powers. So it doesn't really affect the power position of the main global powers in a substantial way. It can also be done while imposing little or no cost on the strong. Ideally, it should be. And of course, it should leave their relative position unaffected. It should not be interpretable as a ploy to change the distribution of power among the more powerful states. So one reform dimension that meets these conditions, in my view, is something I've been working on for the last so many years, which is trying to find a substitute or a partial substitute for patent monopolies. Patent monopolies are deeply immoral because poor people are excluded from innovation, both from the innovations that actually exist and also from innovative activities. Nobody innovates for the poor because they cannot pay the monopoly prices that would be necessary to get access to these innovations. And in addition, patent monopolies are also deeply irrational from a collective point of view. So, for example, when we fight infectious diseases and pandemics in particular, by leaving out the poor and reserving treatments to the more affluent, we are ensuring that these infectious diseases stay around and hit us again and again in new versions. These diseases form drug resistance over time, and they also form new variants that may come back and hurt humanity and endanger people again and again. Obviously, the rational strategy would be to include poor people and to have a global, universal strategy of fighting diseases in such a way that we actually get rid of infectious diseases as we have done with smallpox, rather than allowing them to fester as we do with tuberculosis, malaria, COVID, AIDS, and so forth. Similarly, in the fight for an ecologically sound planet, the patent monopolies are extremely detrimental in that we are excluding large chunks of the world population or deterring them from using green technologies. We are almost all the green technologies we have contain patented components. These patented components are vastly more expensive than they would be without patents. And so in order to reward the innovators of these components, we make green technologies more expensive and thereby weaken their competitive position against dirtier, older technologies. And so in many cases, certainly throughout the developing countries, dirty technologies are being preferred, even while green technologies would be chosen if they were selling at competitive prices rather than at prices that are artificially inflated by monopoly patents. So in this regard, too, it is not just the injustice of this patent monopoly regime, but also the collective irrationality of it, because we all suffer from the fact that more emissions enter the atmosphere, and we all suffer from the fact and are affected by the risks and dangers that arise from infectious diseases continuing to proliferate, pandemics continuing to be a threat, and so forth. So that's one example of the kind of reform that meets all the conditions of a promising political reform project in the domain of international institutions, because it leaves the competitive position of leading states unchanged. It is morally unambiguously endorsable by all different cultures, and it also solves a collective action problem in that it improves the condition and prospects pretty much of everyone by reducing emissions or reducing the danger of infectious diseases. An example of procedural progress would be the inclusion of the African Union in the G20. This is something, together with others, I've recently advocated in the T20, G20 process. It's a relatively small step, perhaps, but a symbolically important step that would also strengthen the African Union on the African continent and make it more likely that African countries find ways of working together, because the only way they could exert influence within this important body of the G20 would be by getting their act together and working up a joint position within the African Union that the African Union could then represent at the G20 in their behalf. Now, what we need to do at the global level is also to gradually build supranational organs and organs that come with a normative expectation of impartiality. So instead of having institutions like the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, and so on, all the various UN institutions are by and large ones in which state representatives are expected to represent the interests of their states and to draw on the economic and military power of their states to advance these interests. What we need instead is the emergence of institutions that are impartial, in the sense that those people who are officials in these institutions will represent not the interests of their home state, but rather will impartially administer rules, will impartially try to promote global justice and the common global good, and will basically not be tied to their home state. Now, these institutions, of which courts could be a potential model, are the kinds of institutions that could, over time, build trust and get a genuine progress towards more moralized global institutional arrangements going. The International Criminal Court is an example. It's unfortunately boycotted, of course, by some important countries, including the United States, which has even passed a law, the so-called the Hague Invasion Act, which is a law that entitles or authorizes the US president to send armed forces to the Netherlands to rescue any American and allied military service personnel from this court. But it is a step in the right direction, even though a contested one. Similarly, it would be good to have a court-like gremium that would decide about the justifiability of humanitarian interventions. If these decisions could be taken out of the hands of institutions and councils that are beholden to the interests of nation states, like, of course, the Security Council is, then we could get an objective assessment of whether a particular situation in the world is intervenable, is one fit for humanitarian intervention or not. And with such a verdict, it might then become much harder to intervene under the false pretense that this intervention is justifiable as humanitarian. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we should try to create a global forum where representatives of diverse cultures can have real normative discussions on matters of supranational institutional design. So for this purpose, we have proposed also in the G20, T20 process, a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly where people would be directly elected by the populations of countries. So this would not be representatives of governments representing only a small sliver of any particular country, but these would be people elected by the people of the country, and so more representative. And one important task for them would be to talk about issues of common concern, of supranational concern, from a moral point of view, bringing cultural perspectives to bear and really talking it out. And only if we had made such attempts can we possibly know to what extent intercultural disagreement really is an obstacle, and to what extent, as I suspect it can be overcome and can really be overcome as a potential obstacle on the path to a shareable, widely shareable global institutional order. Good. This was it for today.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to record my thanks to CSPS for organizing such an excellent lecture and for having invited me along with Professor Thomas-Pogge, who has many admirers and in India, and who usually do catch up with his it's not, of course, the first time that Professor Pogge is giving a lecture in India, but he has done it so many times. And what was different this time was, of course, his trying to address this whole question of cultural diversity. On earlier accounts, Professor Pogge has more or less, dealt with questions of, of course, the rules-based world order, the moral progress in the world around us, and how can we achieve that vis-a-vis many issues such as climate change, the illicit financial flows, and so many other global concerns. And besides, of course, his very trademark work on cosmopolitanism, for instance. And so this was a big change for him to be speaking on cultural diversity. I guess, and I was somewhere trying, and I was looking at this whole, with rapt attention, and I really enjoyed this whole lecture. And I must say that it neatly is fine-tuned to his other approaches on areas of global justice, and that he has been working on assiduously and tirelessly for the last couple of decades, in fact. So this is very much in tune with what he has said before, and especially, for having, I think, argued very solidly, in my view, that cultural diversity or questions of cultural difference cannot be an excuse that some states might take to jettison or to abandon the whole approach towards moral progress, towards achieving a rules-based, globally just order. So this, I take this, that this is one way of trying to take care of the criticism that we often have about how do we make the lives of the people, and especially the poor people, much better in the world around us, and how the questions of cultural difference must not come in the way. But on the other hand, I also see that there is yet another attempt by Professor Pogge to somewhere, politically ground the entire cultural diversity argument in a framework of a more feasible human rights regime that attends to global inequalities of all kinds, and that have been perpetrated institutionally by some of the more powerful states. So how do we politically ground this? On the one hand, this is the one. And on the other hand, there is an argument that this cannot be an excuse for abandoning the cause of moral progress. So I think, and then both of them dovetail, very neatly, and especially towards the end, where he speaks about the sort of reforms that we need, including the substantive and the procedural reforms and all those things. And these are very timely ones. For instance, Professor Pogge's advocacy for a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly is something that many states should actually now take up very seriously, or rather, active citizens in most countries. So take this idea forward, and because much of the time what's happening in the United Nations is that, it's already, some of these supranational institutions are already captured, as you must have heard from Professor Pogge, are captured by the rich and the powerful countries. And most of our global institutions, supranational institutions, are completely in the grip of some of these powerful countries, even while there is a kind of a power rivalry going on between different states, and each one wants to have a piece, a piece of cake of its own, a pound of flesh of its own, and they are somewhere engaged in what we might call that Hobbesian contestation of more and more power. So in that sense, I think that the accent on that United Nations Parliamentary Assembly is very timely now, chiefly because many countries and citizens in many countries are now raising more questions about the effectiveness of their governments and the effectiveness of the powers of their state, and why should some, and mostly the governments, only represent the people. The people also have a base, a say. Many of us do not think about these things deeply enough, and that mere tinkering with the reforms at the supranational institutions is not enough. So what Professor Pogge is asking for is a complete, a restructuring of some of these existing global institutions, and some of those structural reforms need to go very, very deep, and both normatively and structurally, and one of the things that might come into the service of this kind of a project is the whole question of trying to bring together different cultures and different states together, what he calls the intercultural dialogue, that then produces the kind of consensus needed. Even if consensus is a bad word, if we can say that there is a certain kind of a very loose and agreement where all cultures and all peoples think that it is wiser to take up this whole question of moral progress and think about those values that unite us, and give every, that every life is worth living, and that they are, and that needs to be taken care of. And what is not happening, and to this, I think many of you who do not know the work of Professor Thomas Pogge, you should know that he faults mainly the global institutions and how they work for many of the conditions that afflict the global population, especially the global poor. So these are all. Whereas I think Thomas, I'm somewhat tempted to also bring to your notice, if you know, that while all these criticisms of human rights, that it's a Western construct and all that, were taking place, there were some who were still trying to bring about, what you might call that moral minimal approach towards human rights across different cultures. And in working towards in this direction, many of the scholars also pointed out, as you may already be aware, that probably many of these questions of rights can be based on a question of minimal human dignity that applies to all cultures, equally everywhere. So all cultures, all religions, nobody would shirk from the from attesting to the value of human dignity as such. And many people felt that probably this is one, one level at which most cultures will agree, and on that agreement, we can then take forward the cross-cultural dialogue on human rights across religions, across cultures, and across civilizations in a much more meaningful way. So that was but of course, that was the culturalist approach to which you do not subscribe, because we don't want to get into the trap of cultural relativism and all that. But even some of these people thought that dignity could be one of the basis of that. I have basically, not really, I completely agree or would want to agree with whatever you have said, but basically two worries. And, and one of the worry is that at one level, I think, even when we talk about this whole question of intercultural dialogue, giving rise to a certain kind of a understanding or subscription to some of the political values that outline for us a moral progress of the, and of course, in a feasible manner and a long-term version of it. And we keep trying on it. We don't give up, so there will be some advantages after a while. And then again, we work for an even better future. No, I agree I agree with that position where you say that the intercultural dialogue is important. But, there is also another thing that you pointed out towards the end, that unless and until we have a global institution like the United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, for instance, many of these cross-cultural dialogues may not happen, right? And so there is a sort of a, if I might say it, but a kind of a catch-22 situation, that in order to bring in that global forum where we have this cross-cultural dialogue, requires a lot of attention to that initial stages where we have a minimal kind of a an intercultural dialogue to bring in a certain vision of the moral progress, and then work towards it in order to have a better forum where many of these cultural differences can, again, we can go back to them and we can sort them out. I think many of us who grew up in the 20th century, thought, had a huge hope and vision for the 21st century. And many of us worried that, around the 1990s, which for some reason, I think was an interesting decade of the last century. Towards the end of it, many of us felt that, democracies are on the decline, the parties will all go away, and 21st century comes and we find that the political parties, and their significance have risen very sharply. And then, of course, the 9/11, and then the different trajectories in which many democracies took their path, have been in some ways a little worrisome. So the 21st century actually didn't live up to the promise that we thought it might. And one of the last things that people want to talk these days is about cultural diversity, is about multiculturalism, and that I think is a little unfortunate in today's political discourse. Very, very unfortunate, I guess. That how can we have a basic respect for difference and disagreement in a democracy is what matters to us. And only after we attend to some of these differences and disagreements in a domestic setting, can we then think about how do we attend to, bringing about a certain kind of an agreement at the global level on how must we live together, right? So that's that. So where do we begin, and how do we, take up this whole question of intercultural dialogue? Is something that bothers me, given that there is a kind of an instability in the democratic attitudes in most countries, which is a little intolerant of different views. And then to think about how might this work at the global level is something that I would be interested to hear more about. Second, and that's another worry, is that, while you talked about, and we all agree, with the kind of, views that you held. And I think, about the sort of world that we live in, with all these kinds of prospects of destruction looming over us. Many of us think, and for good, right reasons, I would say, that we don't attend to many of these issues unless and until there is a crisis. Right, so there is a huge crisis that comes over us, and then we immediately, say, okay, now let's do something about the rules-based order that we have in the world. The pandemic was one such instance. It showed, the deficiencies in our global system, in our national systems, that many of the things, many things happened surreptitiously during this time. So there was discrimination. That was, the governments discriminated between people and between their own people and other people's. And many of us felt that the pandemic has taught us one good or a few good lessons that we must now reposition ourselves vis-a-vis, let us say, universal global health care. And how must we then attend to the needs of the global poor in terms of vaccines and now the crisis and all that. And somewhere during the towards the end of the pandemic, we all felt a little hopeful of what we how we might turn things around. But unfortunately, the pandemic came and has gone away, and I don't think we have learned our lessons very well. So we have moved out of one crisis, and one of the immediate takeaways from this crisis is that actually we haven't moved forward. And so I would say that this crisis has also, come and gone, and crises, do not always, bring in though there has been some kind of a, some sort of very significant discussions that have been taken place in global institutions and all that. But that's very small, too little and too late, I would say, and it's not been enough. So, so even after a huge global crisis has hit us, we still are yet to think about the contours of that moral progress that we are thinking about here. And so of the two worries, one is how do we move forward with this whole question of intercultural dialogue is something that we really need to address unless and until, we treat cultural difference with some respect. And the second is, that the crisis also do not teach us many lessons. So how do we then envisage the political project of reconceiving the whole question of moral progress, under more normal times, even when there are no crises. But I truly enjoyed listening to Thomas once again, and thanks to CSPS for this opportunity. And yeah, thank you. So.
Thank you, Professor Acharya and Professor Pogge. Hope to see you soon together once again.
Thank you.